That damned auto-tune thing. Today I want to talk a little bit about auto-tune and pitch correction in recording of modern music. Now, I'm far from being an expert on this, but it's something that comes up again and again in considering modern music, and some people absolutely hate the use of auto-tune and pitch correction because they think it's a kind of cheating, and I can understand their point. If a person can't sing naturally, then isn't it cheating to fix their pitch technologically? Well, possibly. First of all, I'd like to say something about the difference between auto-tune and pitch correction. I think pitch correction is a more general term for correcting the pitch in a note. When a singer sings a note and it's not quite on the note, you can adjust that so that it goes up and reaches the note. Auto-tune, as the name suggests, is a very automated approach to that. So you enter certain parameters into the program, push a button, and it goes through and corrects the whole vocal. Whereas pitch correction tends to be a more manual process. You don't necessarily just automatically go through the whole song. You look at the song and you fix what needs to be fixed. Now, whether that's something that's going by the by and people are using a more automatic process more and more, I'm not really sure. I want to discuss one thing that people raise when the question of auto-tune comes up. They imply or suggest that in the past, singers actually used to be able to sing. They used to record the song and they didn't need all these tools to correct their pitch. I guess the implication is that either they were better or just that they worked harder. I can understand the argument that they worked harder. I mean, if you've got pitch correction available, why bother going over the vocal a dozen times? Just let the program fix it. But I don't think it can be argued that people in the past could just sing better. I think that's just complete nonsense. But it's also not really true that in the past what you heard on a record was what you would hear, for example, in a live performance. That's not true for several reasons. First of all, flaws in a vocal were often covered up by overdubbing. So you would use several layers of the person's vocal, and that can cover a multitude of sins. Or they would use backing vocalists, or they would use a high degree of reverb, or some other technique for covering up the errors in the vocal. But one thing that I think everybody used, but they do to a lesser extent these days, is that they would record the vocal multiple times. And then they would edit together the best things from the different tracks, I suspect. And not just pick the best track, but actually edit a track so that it was the best. So what you hear on the record is not going to be what you hear live. It wasn't then, it isn't now. I also want to highlight a difference between using auto-tune, for example, as a corrective tool and auto-tune as a special effects device. Now, the special effects thing started to come into fashion when Cher recorded Believe, and she added that weird twangy sound to her voice. So it wasn't used for correcting her pitch, but to create a particular vocal effect. And that became very popular after that, and I suspect rather overused. There are artists today, people I think like SZA, Travis Scott, Drake, Post Malone, The Weeknd, who seem to use auto-tune all the time as an effect, and it just becomes dull and boring, and you don't hear their own voice. You hear this kind of electronic version of their voice. I don't like that. I don't mind it occasionally used as a special effect to create a particular effect, but used all the time over the whole song, it's just awful. You never actually hear the vocal performance of the person. I'm not sure about this, but I believe you can also use this technique these days in a live performance. So I guess they can reproduce that on stage. So even in a live performance, you may not actually be hearing the real vocal, which I think is a big shame. Its use in pitch correction is another issue. And I think it kind of misses the point of what a good voice is. Human beings rarely hit a note perfectly. Even in a really good voice, there's always fluctuation around the note, or the person climbs to the note. Maybe they overshoot and go back down. But there's never this perfect fit, which is what autotune as a kind of snap to grid mechanism does, and it creates a completely artificial and really quite unpleasant sound. If you consider a vocalist such as Adele or Billie Eilish, it would be an absolute crime to auto-tune or even to pitch correct them, because the beauty of their voice is in the vibrato, in the way they approach a note rather than hitting it exactly, whether they consciously go above or below the note sometimes. This is done quite deliberately, and it adds colour and tone to the vocal that is simply lost if you auto-tune or pitch correct everything so that it's perfect. It's the fluctuations, the variation in the voice. This is not just not hitting the note, okay? This is not someone who just can't reach that note as they're singing. This is a purposeful and deliberate use of the human voice to give colour and flavour to the vocal. And when that is auto-tuned or pitch corrected, it's an abomination. It's a disaster. So there are certainly voices where auto-tune should not be used, or pitch correction at all, because all the colour, all the flavour, everything that makes that person's voice special and unique is kind of ironed out flat. Now, I've no doubt that there are some performers out there who really can't sing that well, and they have to have the pitch correction applied to their voice on the recording. And of course, in a live performance, if that's not also pitch corrected in some way, I'm sure the technology is advancing on that all the time, they probably sound pretty awful. Now, I don't actually attend many live performances. I can't afford it these days. But also, if I like a song, the way a song sounds on a recording, I really don't want to go to a concert and hear the person sing out of tune. I don't mind if they do conscious, deliberate variations on the song, maybe play it as an acoustic version or slow down the phrasing here, or flip a note here or there. But if they simply can't sing the notes, I really don't want to hear it. Now, live performances are never going to be as good as studio recordings. There's a whole heap of reasons for this. One is the opportunity to do the song over and over again, either until you get it exactly right or until the bits can be patched together to make a perfect version of the song. But the acoustics of the studio, the whole atmosphere in the studio is so completely different from a live performance that it's never going to sound exactly the same. There are all sorts of reasons why a person on the day may not sing as well as they can. Perhaps they're not well, perhaps they're tired, perhaps their vocal cords are strained, perhaps the venue itself doesn't lend itself well to a vocal performance. There are all kinds of reasons why a live performance is probably never going to sound quite as good as a studio performance. And I guess for all those reasons, I really am not that keen on live performances. Unless it's someone like Adele who can really use their voice as a musical instrument. If you consider the difference between someone like Adele and someone like Taylor Swift, I think it's quite interesting. Adele comes from a more R&B sort of background. She's got a lot of vibrato in her voice, and she uses these fluctuations and effects in her voice to great effect. Taylor Swift comes from a country music background where people just don't use vibrato. They go or attempt to go from note to note quite cleanly. And that's still often present in Taylor Swift's vocals, even when she's not performing country music. You don't really hear Taylor Swift doing R&B type performances. And I think she'd probably struggle with that because it's completely out of her ballpark. It's a completely different style of singing, and it's something that she's not used to doing, not trained to do. So in a case of Taylor Swift, you expect her to go from this note to that note fairly cleanly. If she doesn't, as from time to time she doesn't in concert, then it doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound particularly good. Because Adele does this modulating of her voice, because she has the vibrato, and because she plays with the note all the time, wrong notes, if they exist at all, are not really a concern because she plays with the note all the time, and you don't expect this going from this note straight to that note. If that happened with an Adele song, it would sound rather strange, and that's what maybe auto-correcting would do to it, a pitch correction would do to it. Now, as I say, every performer has their bad days. Even the best performers have their bad days. I've seen, for instance, live performances of Taylor Swift, recorded obviously, but live performances, where, she sometimes doesn't hit the note or she's clearly off that day. She has a cold in one instance. In another, she's clearly very emotional about the song she's singing and it affects her voice. If Adele has a bad day, it probably isn't quite as noticeable. Her voice is already a little bit husky. It's already purposefully out of tune in some instances. The same with someone like, say, Amy Winehouse. So it's going to vary enormously from artist to artist whether their voice is going to need pitch correction or not. Obviously, full marks to someone who doesn't use it, but only if their voice is actually good. I don't want to listen to a record where someone's just singing out of tune and it's not very good. Maybe they shouldn't be singing at all. Full marks to someone who can perform live and not necessarily reproduce the sound of the studio recording exactly, but still sound really good. And I think the Adele kind of singers have a bit of an advantage in that we're used to hearing them playing with the melody. Anyway, auto-tune, pitch correction is not going to go away. I think it would be an absolute travesty to use pitch correction on a voice like that of Billie Eilish or Adele. I think it's probably less of a travesty to use it on someone like Taylor Swift when you want those clean notes. Having said that, I really hope that she can do without it. These days, probably to save time, to save money, they use pitch correction rather than have someone perform the vocal over and over again. But I really admire someone who can do a live performance and sound good, don't we all? Unfortunately, many people can't.